They told me not to make him feel rejected. That was the instruction. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? Just a few words, but it wasn't simple. It was the heaviest thing I've ever had to carry. I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times, maybe more. What did they mean? What were they asking me to do? And what did it turn me into? I'm Rachel. I'm 42. For years, I worked as a maid at a hotel, a very nice hotel. I was good at my job. I was quiet. I was dependable. I came in, did my work, and went home. I don't like conflict. I just wanted to keep my head down and pay my bills. That job was important. It was everything, really. It was how I supported myself. You don't take risks when you're in that position. You do what you're told. The hotel had its own way of doing things. Certain guests were treated differently. They were important. That's the word they always used. Important. Management's main rule was keeping those guests happy. It wasn't written down anywhere, but we all knew. A happy, high-paying guest was worth more than an employee's complaint. We learned to be silent. Silence was safe. Then Mr. Whitmore checked in. He was a long-term guest, a millionaire, they said. He was going to be staying for months. He was immediately labeled as one of the important ones, very important. A few days after he arrived, my manager, Mrs. Evans, pulled me aside. She took me into her office. It felt serious. I was worried I'd done something wrong. My mind was racing, trying to think of any mistake I could have made. But it wasn't about a mistake, it was about him. She told me that Mr. Whitmore had specifically requested me to be the only person to service his suite. I thought that was a bit strange, but not unheard of. Sometimes guests get comfortable with one person. I just nodded. Then she gave me the instruction. She looked me right in the eye. She told me Mr. Whitmore could be sensitive. She told me he was an extremely valuable client. And then she said it, Rachel, your job is to be accommodating. Above all, do not make him feel rejected. I remember just standing there, rejected? What did that mean? I asked her to explain. I needed to understand what my boundaries were. She just waved her hand. She said it was about professionalism. She told me to use my judgment, but to always lean towards making him feel comfortable, welcomed. The message was clear, even if the words were not. Don't say no. So I started cleaning his suite. Just me. Every day. At first, it was normal. I'd go in, do my work, and leave. He was rarely there. Then he started being there. He'd be in the room when I arrived. He would just sit and watch me work. It was unnerving. I'm used to being invisible. That's the job. You're not supposed to be noticed, but he noticed me. He would sit in a chair and just watch. I tried to ignore it. I focused on cleaning, on folding the towels, on making the bed. I just wanted to get it done and get out. I didn't say anything. What could I say? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just sitting in his own room. But it felt wrong. It felt like I was on display. Then he started asking for small things. He'd ask me to stay a little longer to reorganize his desk. It wasn't part of my duties, but I did it. I remembered the instruction. Don't make him feel rejected. Refusing to organize his papers, would that be rejection? I didn't know, so I just did it. The next time, he asked me to stay and wait while he finished a phone call, just in case he needed something. I waited for 20 minutes. Standing there, I felt foolish, but I was also scared. Scared of that vague warning from my manager. Each time I did something extra, he would thank me. But it wasn't a normal thank you. It felt possessive, like I had passed some kind of test. I tried to set a boundary in a small way. I started telling him I had other rooms to get to. He would just smile. He'd say they could wait. He told me he'd spoken to management and they understood his needs came first. I didn't know if that was true, but I couldn't risk calling his bluff. The other maids noticed. They saw me going into his suite and not coming out for a long time. They'd ask me what was going on. I didn't know what to tell them. I was embarrassed. I just said he was particular. I felt so isolated. It was like I was living under this one secret rule that nobody else had to follow. One day, I tried to talk to Mrs. Evans again. I went to her office. I was careful with my words. I told her that Mr. Whitmore was asking me to do things outside of my normal duties. I told her it was making me uncomfortable, that he was always in the room. She listened. She had that polite, professional mask on her face. When I was done, she told me she understood. She said that dealing with high-profile guests requires a special kind of patience. She reminded me how important his account was to the hotel. She framed it as a challenge, a sign of her trust in me. She told me she knew I could handle it. And then she said it again. Just keep him happy, Rachel. Don't make him feel rejected. It was a dead end. I walked out of that office feeling colder than when I went in. She hadn't heard me, or she had, and she didn't care. My discomfort didn't matter. The hotel's reputation did, his money did. That was when I started to feel trapped, really trapped. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was a performance. And I didn't know the script. All I knew was my one line, don't say no. The walk back from Mrs. Evans's office was the longest walk of my life. The plush hallway carpet, usually silent, seemed to sigh under my feet. Each step was heavy. I felt the weight of her words, the smooth, polished dismissal of my fear. He's an important man, Rachel. Just be professional. We trust you to handle it. Handle what? What was I handling? I was a maid. I cleaned things. I made beds and wiped counters and emptied trash cans. I was not equipped to handle the silent, watching weight of a man like Mr. Whitmore. I was not trained for this. The words echoed in my head. A useless mantra. Don't make him feel rejected. It wasn't a guideline anymore. It was a cage. Mrs. Evans had just checked the lock and walked away with the key. My hand trembled as I held the key card to the penthouse suite. The little green light felt like a warning. I pushed the door open. The air inside was still and cool, smelling faintly of the expensive cologne he wore and the lemon polish I used. It smelled like his space, not my workspace, his. He was sitting in the same armchair, the one facing the door. He hadn't moved. A book was open on his lap, but his eyes were on me. There was no anger in them, no impatience. Just a calm, unnerving stillness. It was worse than anger. It was the look of a man who was used to waiting, who knew that whatever he was waiting for would eventually arrive. Everything all right, Rachel? He asked. His voice was smooth like river stones. I couldn't tell him I had just been to my manager to complain about him. That would be a rejection, wouldn't it? A big one. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Mrs. Evans just needed to review the weekly schedule. The lie felt clumsy and thin in my mouth. He smiled, a small knowing thing that didn't reach his eyes. Of course. He closed his book and placed it on the table beside him. The sound was soft, but it felt like a gavel coming down. An order. The performance was starting again. I went about my routine, but my body felt disconnected from my mind. I emptied the small wastebasket by his desk. I straightened the already perfect stack of newspapers. My movements were stiff, robotic. I could feel his gaze on me, tracking me as I moved from the living area to the kitchenette. It was like trying to work with a hot spotlight on my back. I was wiping down the granite countertops when he spoke again. Rachel. I froze, my hand hovering over the cold stone. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Come here for a moment. It wasn't a question. I put the cloth down. I dried my hands on my apron, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. I walked back into the living area and stood a few feet in front of his chair. It felt like being summoned. On the polished mahogany coffee table, there was a small flat box wrapped in dark blue paper with a silver ribbon. It hadn't been there before. I find myself in a predicament, he said, gesturing toward the box. I bought that for my niece. Her birthday is next week, but I'm not sure it's right for her. She's a young woman, delicate. I just stared at the box. What did this have to do with me? What was I supposed to say? I was hoping you might offer an opinion, he continued. He leaned forward and untied the ribbon with slow, deliberate fingers. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a necklace. It was a simple, elegant chain of white gold with a single, teardrop-shaped sapphire. It was beautiful. It was the kind of thing I had only ever seen behind reinforced glass. It's very lovely, sir, I said. My voice was a stranger's. Yes, but is it right? He mused, looking at the necklace and then back at me. His eyes lingered on my neck, on the collar of my uniform. It's hard to tell when it's just lying in a box. An item like that needs a person. The air left my lungs. I knew what was coming. I knew it with a sickening, absolute certainty. Silence stretched. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Silence was safe. But for how long? Was my silence a rejection? Would you? He asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Would you mind trying it on for me, just for a moment, so I can see how it hangs? My mind screamed, "No, no, this isn't my job. This is wrong. You can't ask me to do this." But my mouth was dry. I saw Mrs. Evans's face, her polite, unhelpful smile. Don't make him feel rejected. What would happen if I said no? Would he call her? Would she tell me I wasn't being professional? Would I lose my job over a necklace? My son needed braces. My car needed new tires. The rent was due in a week. These were the simple, heavy facts of my life. They were heavier than my fear. I gave a small, jerky nod. "Excellent," he said, his smile widening slightly. He stood up and picked up the necklace. The gem winked in the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was tall, taller than I had realized. He stepped toward me, and I had to fight every instinct that told me to step back. Don't step back. That's a rejection. He held the necklace out. For a second, I thought he was going to hand it to me, but he didn't. He moved behind me. I stood there, rigid, my arms glued to my sides. I could feel the warmth of his body close to my back. Though he wasn't touching me, I could smell his cologne stronger now. It was suffocating. His fingers brushed the back of my neck as he moved my collar aside. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I squeezed my eyes shut. I felt the cold, delicate chain slide around my throat. His knuckles grazed my skin again as he worked the tiny clasp. It felt like an eternity. Then it was done. "There," he said. He was still standing right behind me. "Open your eyes." I did. He had moved to the side and he was watching my reflection in the polished surface of the dark television screen across the room. I saw myself, a woman in a plain gray uniform, her face pale and tight, and around her neck a jewel that glowed with a deep, impossible blue. It didn't belong. It looked like a brand. "Turn around," he commanded softly. I turned to face him. He wasn't looking at the necklace anymore. He was looking at my face. His expression was one of quiet satisfaction, like an artist who had just placed a final, perfect brushstroke on a canvas. "Yes," he said to himself more than to me. "That's it." My hand started to lift to take it off. "Leave it," he said. The words were not harsh, but they were absolute. "Wear it while you finish your work. I want to get a sense of it." I couldn't speak. This was the shock. It wasn't just about seeing how it looked. He wanted me to wear it. He wanted me to be decorated for him while I worked in his home. I was no longer just the maid. I was part of the scenery he had arranged for himself. A doll in his dollhouse. What did it turn me into? I nodded again. There was nothing else to do. I went back to my duties, the necklace a cold, heavy weight against my collarbone. I wiped the counters I had already wiped. I straightened the pillows on the sofa. I moved through the suite like a ghost, hyper-aware of the jewel on my skin and the man in the chair, watching me wear it. The work was a meaningless pantomime. My only real job in that room was to be seen. An hour later, my shift was over. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the expensive rug. I gathered my cleaning caddy, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped a bottle of glass cleaner. "You can go now, Rachel," he said, not looking up from his book. He had picked it up again at some point, though I doubted he had read a single word. I walked to the door, my steps quickening. I had to get out. My hand went to the clasp of the necklace. "Ah," he said, and I froze. "I just leave it on the table." I fumbled with the clasp, my fingers clumsy and stupid. Finally, it came undone. I held the necklace in my palm. It was already warm from my skin. I placed it gently back in its velvet box on the coffee table and closed the lid. I didn't look at him. "Thank you, Rachel," he said as I pulled the door open. "That was very helpful." I didn't answer. I slipped out into the hallway and let the door click shut behind me. I leaned against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Down in the staff locker room, I changed out of my uniform. I looked at myself in the small cracked mirror above the sinks. My face was pale. And there, on the skin just above my collarbone, was a faint red line where the necklace had rested. A mark. He had marked me. And the most terrifying part, the part that made a cold dread pool in my stomach, was the thought that popped into my head, unbidden. He said it was for his niece, but he had put it back in the box, on the table, in his suite. It would be there tomorrow, waiting. The heavy wood of Mrs. Evans's office door clicked shut behind me. The sound final and absolute. It was a dead end. The sound echoed in the sudden sterile silence of the hallway. For a moment, I just stood there, my maid's uniform feeling too tight across my shoulders, the fabric scratching at my skin. She had used words like professionalism and discretion. She had talked about Mr. Whitmore being a valuable client. She never used the word no. She just reshaped my fear into a job requirement. Handle it. That's what she'd said, as if my feeling of being trapped, of being watched and used like a doll, was just a spill on the carpet that needed the right chemical to make it disappear. I didn't go back to the staff room right away. I couldn't face the chatter, the questions in the other maid's eyes. Maria would know something was wrong. She always did. And what would I tell her? That I was afraid of a guest? That my boss told me my fear didn't matter? It sounded pathetic, even to me. It sounded like a problem a person with choices could have. I did not have choices. My hands were shaking. I shoved them into the pockets of my apron. I walked to the end of the hall and took the service elevator down to the lobby level. My reflection a pale, worried ghost in the polished steel doors. The main lobby was a world away, all gold light and quiet, expensive chatter. Guests in beautiful clothes drifted past, their lives seemingly as smooth and untroubled as the marble beneath their feet. I was invisible to them, just part of the machinery that made their comfort possible. The bus ride home was a blur of smeared city lights. I rested my forehead against the cool, vibrating glass and closed my eyes, but the image of the suite was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The sapphire necklace lying on the polished nightstand, the weight of it on my skin. The silence of the room thick with his watching. Don't make him feel rejected. The words weren't just a warning from my manager anymore. They felt like a law of physics in that suite. A rule I could no more break than I could stop gravity. What would happen if I did? Would he complain? Would I be fired? Was that all? It felt like it was more than that. The warning felt darker, deeper. My apartment is small, one bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough for one person, and a living room crowded with a worn-out sofa and a television I rarely watched. It was my sanctuary. But that night, it felt like a cage of a different kind. The bills were piled on the small kitchen counter, a reminder from the landlord about the rent, due in 3 days, a pharmacy receipt for my mother's medication. Each piece of paper was a link in the chain that led me back to that hotel, back to that penthouse suite. I couldn't eat. I made a cup of tea, but the warmth did nothing to stop the chill deep in my bones. I sat on the sofa and stared at the dark screen of the television. What did he want? It wasn't just about the necklace. It was about the watching. It was the way he sat there, so still, his presence filling every corner of the room until I could barely breathe. He wasn't just a guest in a hotel. In that suite, he was a king, and his quiet desires were commands. Sleep didn't come. Every time I drifted off, I felt the cold weight of the jewels on my collarbone and the heavier weight of his gaze. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Evans had said, that he had requested me specifically. Why? I was good at my job, yes. I was thorough, quiet, but so were others. What had he seen in me? A weakness? A stillness he thought he could shape to his own liking? What did it turn me into? The next morning, putting on my uniform felt like putting on a costume for a part I no longer wanted to play. The crisp, clean fabric did nothing to make me feel professional or protected. It just felt like the clothes of a victim. Every step toward the hotel was heavy. Every person I passed on the street seemed freer than I was. The elevator ride up to the penthouse floor was the longest of my life. The soft ding as it arrived on his floor was like a death knell. My heart hammered against my ribs. My hand trembled as I held the key card to the lock. It beeped green. I took a deep breath, the way you do before diving into cold water, and pushed the door open. "Good morning, Rachel." His voice came from the living area. It was calm, level. Nothing in it suggested the strangeness of the day before. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought maybe he would pretend it never happened. Maybe it was a one-time impulse, an oddity we could both forget. He was sitting in the same armchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning light silhouetting his frame. The city sprawled out behind him like a kingdom. He held a coffee cup in one hand. He was already dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit. He looked normal, important. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." I said, my voice barely a whisper. I kept my eyes on the floor as I pushed my cart into the suite. Silence was safe. Work was safe. I started my routine, collecting trash, stripping the linens from the bed in the guest room first, trying to put as much space between us as possible. I could feel him, though. Even with my back to him, I could feel his attention like a physical touch. The air was thick with it. After I finished the guest room, there was no more avoiding it. I had to go into the master bedroom, which connected to the living area where he sat. I pushed my cart toward the doorway, my gaze fixed on the carpet. He spoke again, his voice stopping me in my tracks. "Before you begin in here." I froze. I slowly lifted my head. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking toward the master bedroom, a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his head. "On the bed," he said. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look. I felt my feet move, one in front of the other, as if they belonged to someone else. I stepped into the bedroom, and there, laid out perfectly in the center of the vast, immaculate king-size bed, was a dress. It was simple, sleeveless, the color of a stormy sea. Dark blue, almost gray. The fabric looked soft, like silk or something pretending to be. Next to it, a pair of simple, low-heeled black shoes. There was no box, no tag. They were just there, an offering, a command. I stood there, staring, my mind a complete blank. I couldn't process it. A dress? Why was there a dress? I turned back toward him. He had risen from his chair and was now standing in the doorway between the living room and the bedroom, blocking my exit. He hadn't moved closer, but his presence filled the space. He watched my face, his own expression unreadable. "I thought that would be more comfortable for you," he said, his voice still unnervingly gentle. The uniform seemed so stiff. The lie was so enormous, so audacious, it almost made me want to laugh. Comfort? He said it was for my comfort. The necklace had been because the room's light suited it. His reasons were like smoke, impossible to grasp, meant only to obscure the truth. This wasn't about my comfort. This was about his pleasure. I just stared at him. The word no rose in my throat, a desperate, silent scream. "No, I will not. I am a maid. I wear a uniform. This is my job." But the word died before it could find air. I saw Mrs. Evans' placid, dismissive face. I saw the pile of bills on my counter. I felt the terrifying stillness in the room, the sense that I was balanced on the edge of something awful. Don't make him feel rejected. What would happen if I said no to this? The necklace was one thing. This was another. This was my body, my identity. He wanted to strip me of my uniform and dress me in something of his choosing. He wanted to change me. He didn't need to say anything else. He just waited. The silence was his weapon. It pressed down on me, forcing a decision. And there was only one decision I was allowed to make. I gave a small, jerky nod. I couldn't meet his eyes. I turned and walked toward the master bathroom, my legs feeling like lead. The dress was still on the bed. Did he expect me to pick it up? He cleared his throat softly, and I knew the answer. I walked back, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the soft fabric. It was cool to the touch. I picked up the shoes. The bathroom was a cavern of white marble and gold fixtures. I shut the door and leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked at myself in the vast mirror. Me, Rachel, 42 years old, in my maid's uniform. It was the last time I would see myself like this today. Slowly, I unbuttoned my uniform top. I folded it carefully, placing it on the marble counter. I did the same with my pants, my work shoes, my armor, piece by piece laid aside. I was left standing in my simple underthings in a room more luxurious than any I had ever been in. I felt small and exposed. I picked up the dress. It slid over my skin, cool and unnervingly smooth. It fit perfectly, of course it did. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through me. He had looked at me enough to know my exact size. The shoes, too. They slid onto my feet as if they were made for me. I looked in the mirror again. A stranger looked back. A woman in a simple, elegant blue dress and sensible shoes. A woman who looked like she might be a guest's personal assistant or a companion. She didn't look like a maid. She didn't look like me. I stood there for a long time. What was I supposed to do now? Go out there and do what? Clean? In this dress? The absurdity of it was dizzying. A soft knock came at the door. One single polite tap. "Rachel?" he called. His voice was unchanged. "Is everything all right?" I swallowed. Yes, I managed to say, "Fine." I opened the door. He was standing right there. He looked me up and down. It wasn't a lustful look, it was something else. Slower, more thoughtful. It was the look of an artist, appraising his work, a look of ownership. He gave a single, satisfied nod. "Much better," he said softly. "Now you can begin." He stepped aside, gesturing back toward my cart, still parked by the bedroom door. He expected me to work, to push my cart and dust his shelves and scrub his floors, dressed like his doll. I picked up the feather duster, the plastic handle alien in my hand. I wasn't a hotel employee anymore. I wasn't Rachel. In that room, in that dress, I was simply his. And the day had only just begun. The silence in the suite was a physical thing. It pressed in on my ears, heavy and thick like water. He said I looked like his doll, and the words didn't fade. They clung to me, another layer over the strange smooth fabric of the dress. My own skin felt distant. The sapphire necklace was a cold, hard knot at the base of my throat. I stood there, frozen in the center of the vast living room, my cleaning cart a forgotten island, of my real life a few feet away. His eyes moved over me, not in a leering way, but in a slow, appraising manner, like a collector examining a piece he had just acquired. It was a look of ownership, pure and simple. What was I supposed to do now, clean? Was I really supposed to polish his marble countertops and scrub his glass shower doors dressed like this? The thought was ridiculous. The heels were a particular cruelty, sinking slightly into the plush carpet, forcing me to balance in a way that felt both precarious and deliberate. They were designed to make you stand still, to be looked at. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. I had to do something. I was a maid. I was here to work. That was the reason, the excuse for all of this, wasn't it? My hand, slick with a fine sweat, reached for the handle of my cart. The plastic felt cheap and real under my fingers. Grounding. I pushed it forward a few inches, the wheels silent on the thick rug. "No," he said. The word was quiet, not a command, just a statement. I stopped. My back was to him, but I could feel his gaze on me like a brand. "Leave the cart," he said. I just nodded, my head giving a short, jerky motion. My throat was too tight to speak. I let go of the handle as if it were hot. This was it. The pretense was falling away. Silence stretched again. Seconds felt like minutes. I was a statue in a blue dress. I could hear the faint hum of the city far below, a world away from this room. A world where women who looked like me were cleaning rooms, not standing in them like furniture. "Turn around, Rachel." My name in his voice was a violation. He had never used it before. It made this personal. It meant he knew who he was doing this to. I wasn't just a uniform anymore. I was Rachel, and Rachel was wearing his dress. I turned slowly. The heels made the movement awkward, a clumsy pivot. I kept my eyes fixed on a spot on the wall just over his shoulder. I couldn't look at his face. He was sitting in the same armchair as always, one leg crossed over the other. He hadn't moved. He was just watching. "I don't want you to clean today," he said. His voice was calm, reasonable, like he was telling me the weather. I swallowed. "Mr. Whitmore? There's nothing to be done. The suite is perfect." It wasn't. I knew for a fact there were smudges on the glass coffee table. I knew the wastebasket in the bathroom needed to be emptied. It was my job to know these things. My job was my shield, and he was taking it away from me. What did he want then? If not for me to clean, why was I here? The question screamed in my mind, but I couldn't ask it. To ask was to acknowledge the truth of the situation. To ask was to say no to the fantasy that I was just here to work. "Don't make him feel rejected." Mrs. Evans' voice was a ghost in my ear. "Then, what would you like me to do?" I whispered. The words felt like a surrender. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was the first time I had ever seen him smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "I want you to walk for me," he said. I stared at him. "Walk?" "Just walk," he repeated, gesturing with one hand to the open space of the suite. To the window and back. My mind went blank. Of all the things I had imagined, of all the terrible possibilities that had been churning in my gut, this was not one of them. It was so simple, so strange, and so humiliating. I was a horse being trotted out for a buyer, a model on a catwalk for an audience of one. My purpose was not to do, but to be seen. My feet felt like lead. What if I said no? What would happen? Would he get angry? Would he call Mrs. Evans and tell her I had rejected him? I saw my small apartment, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. I saw my son's hopeful face talking about a summer camp I couldn't afford. Losing this job wasn't an option. It was a dead end. So I walked. My first step was stiff, uncertain. The heels were a challenge. I focused on the far window, the one that looked out over the park. I put one foot in front of the other, my hips unnaturally stiff. I felt his eyes follow my every move. The swish of the dress was the only sound. I reached the wall of glass and stopped, my back to him again. I placed my hand on the cool pane, needing to touch something solid. Below, the city buzzed with life. Yellow cabs looked like tiny insects. People were dots, moving with purpose. They were free. What did I look like from down there? A woman in a blue dress, standing in the window of a penthouse suite. They would think I was lucky. They would think I belonged here. They wouldn't see the cage. Now back, his voice came from behind me, pulling me from the glass. I turned and walked back toward him. This time was harder. I had to walk toward the source of my fear. I kept my gaze down, watching the tips of the dark blue shoes appear and disappear from under the hem of the dress. When I reached the spot where I had started, I stopped, waiting. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt flushed, my skin hot with shame. He was silent for a long time. I risked a glance at him. He was leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his chin resting on his clasped hands. He was studying me, but his expression was unreadable. Blank. Again, he said, his voice soft, and so I did. I walked to the window, turned, and walked back. The path was becoming a track, my track. I was wearing a groove into the floor of my own private hell. With each trip, a piece of me chipped away. The maid, the mother, the woman who paid her bills and kept to herself. They were all fading, leaving only this doll in a blue dress, pacing for her owner. I did it 4 more times. My body started to move on its own, a mindless automaton. The shame was so profound, it became a kind of numbness, a disconnect. This wasn't happening to me, Rachel. It was happening to the woman in the dress. We were 2 different people. Finally, when I stopped before him for the 5th time, he sighed. It was a sound of satisfaction. That's enough, he said. He looked at the expensive watch on his wrist. Your time is almost up for today. Relief washed over me so intensely it made me dizzy. It was almost over. I could escape. Go to the bedroom, he instructed. Change back into your uniform. Leave the dress and the shoes on the bed. He said it so casually. Leave the dress. His property, for him to do with as he pleased until my next shift. And the necklace, he added, his eyes locking onto mine for the first time. They were a pale, flat gray. Leave that as well. I just nodded. I couldn't form words. I walked to the bedroom, my movements stiff. I didn't look back. The bedroom was just as I had left it, my uniform folded neatly on a chair. It looked shabby and pathetic in the luxurious room. But it was mine. With trembling fingers, I reached behind my neck and fumbled with the clasp of the necklace. It took me a moment to get it undone. The moment it came free, I could breathe a little deeper. I laid it carefully on the nightstand, the sapphires dark against the polished wood. I peeled off the dress. The fabric whispered against my skin one last time. I folded it and placed it in the center of the perfectly made bed, an offering. The shoes went beside it. My uniform felt like a suit of armor. The familiar scratch of the polyester, the practical comfort of my worn sneakers. I was Rachel again, but the feeling was wrong. The armor was dented. I felt exposed, seen in a way that I could never undo. When I walked back into the living room, card in hand, ready to flee, he was standing by the door. He held it open for me. Tomorrow, Rachel, he said as I pushed the cart past him, my eyes on the floor. Don't bring your cart. We won't be needing it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I pushed my cart down the silent, empty hallway, the wheels making a rumbling noise on the carpet that sounded like thunder in my ears. The cleaning was over, he had made that clear. Tomorrow, I wouldn't even have the pretense of work to hide behind. What did that turn me into? What was my job now? Don't bring the cart tomorrow. The words followed me out of the suite. They echoed in the plush, silent hallway. They weren't a request. They were a statement of fact, a shift in the foundation of my world. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, the sound final and absolute. I stood there for a moment, my hand still gripping the handle of the cart. My cart, my shield, the collection of bottles and rags and tools that gave me a reason to be here. It was the only thing that separated me from whatever it was I was becoming. Without it, I was just a woman walking into a man's private rooms with no purpose he hadn't invented for her. The walk back to the service elevator felt longer than usual. The wheels of the cart seemed to rumble on the thick carpet, announcing my failure, my compliance. I felt the eyes of the security cameras on me. Did someone watch this? Did they see me go in with a cart and come out with a command that stripped my job away? Did they care? Of course they didn't. He was Mr. Whitmore. He was important. I thought about going to, Mrs. Evans. I imagined walking into her sterile office. My hands trembling, I would tell her. He told me not to bring my cart. He made me walk back and forth in a dress. He's not letting me clean. I could picture her face perfectly. The slight, polite tightening of her lips. The patient fold of her hands on the desk. And, she would ask, did he harm you, Rachel? The question was a trap. No, he hadn't laid a hand on me. He had only used his voice. He had only used his money. He had only used the hotel's desperation to keep him happy. It's about professionalism, Rachel, she would say, her voice smooth and reasonable. A valuable client has a unique request. We handle it. Don't make him feel rejected. The instruction was a cage. It had been from the start. I just hadn't realized how small it was or how securely the door had been locked. Going to Mrs. Evans was a dead end. It always had been. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, the numbers running through my head. Rent, Leo's field trip, the electricity bill that was already a week late. These were not abstract problems. They were solid, heavy things that sat on my chest and made it hard to breathe. The money from Mr. Whitmore's envelope was on my dresser. It was more than 2 days' regular pay. It was the price of the dress. It was the price of walking. What would be the price of sitting still? The thought came out of nowhere and made me feel sick. I turned over, burying my face in my pillow, but the image of his suite, the wide windows, the expensive furniture, his quiet presence, was seared into my mind. The next morning, I got ready for work in a daze. I put on my uniform, the familiar gray fabric a lie. I wasn't a maid today. I pinned my name tag to my chest. Rachel. It felt like someone else's name. In the staff locker room, the other women were grabbing their carts, the clatter of plastic bottles and the snap of fresh liners filling the air with a sense of purpose. Maria nodded at me, her face tired but kind. Rough night? I just nodded. Something like that. She gestured with her chin toward the line of carts. You're not taking one? They're having the penthouse carpets deep cleaned today, I lied. The words felt like ash in my mouth. They don't need me to do anything but a light touch-up later. Mrs. Evans told me to wait. It was a clumsy excuse, but no one was paying that much attention. They had their own rooms, their own routines. My cart stood alone, an abandoned monument to a job I no longer had. Leaving it there felt like leaving a part of myself behind. My hands felt empty. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I took the elevator up. Not the service elevator, but the guest elevator. It felt wrong. The mirrored walls showed me a woman in a maid's uniform with nothing to clean. A prop. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked down this hallway. The silence was different today. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. I raised my hand to knock and it was trembling. I had to steady it with my other hand before I could make a sound. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been waiting right there. Mr. Whitmore was dressed in dark trousers and a simple cream-colored cashmere sweater. He looked soft. He looked harmless. He held a book in one hand, his finger marking his place. He didn't say hello. He just looked at my empty hands. A flicker of something satisfaction in his eyes. Then he stepped back, a silent invitation. I walked inside. The suite was immaculate, of course. Not a cushion out of place, not a speck of dust on the gleaming surfaces. The air smelled faintly of leather and clean linen. It didn't need to be cleaned. It didn't need me. He closed the door behind me, the sound just as final as it had been the day before. I stood in the foyer, waiting for instructions. My entire body was a question mark. What now? Do I walk again? Do I stand here until my shift is over? Today, he said, his voice calm and low, you will sit. He didn't point. He just gestured with his head toward the living area. In the center of the vast room, placed at an odd angle, was a single chair. It was a hard wooden dining chair, one I recognized from the set around the massive dining table. It had been moved. It now sat alone, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows, its back to the rest of the suite. It looked like a punishment, or an exhibition. My throat was dry. Sit? I whispered. Yes, he said, as if it were the most normal request in the world. In the chair, you will look out the window. I walked toward it, my shoes silent on the rug. Each step felt like I was wading through something thick and heavy. I reached the chair. It felt strange and deliberate, this piece of furniture isolated from its purpose. I turned and looked at him. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Don't say no. I sat. The chair was as uncomfortable as it looked. The wood was unyielding against my back. My uniform felt stiff and formal. My job was to sit. My job was to face a window and be still. I heard him move behind me. The soft rustle of his clothing, the whisper of his footsteps on the carpet. He didn't go to the chair where he usually sat to watch me. He went somewhere else, deeper in the suite. I heard the faint sound of a page turning. He was reading. I was supposed to look out the window. The view was breathtaking. The city stretched out below, a map of tiny cars and buildings, but I couldn't see it. My focus was entirely on the room behind me. My ears strained, trying to map his location through sound. The rustle of a page, a soft cough, the distant clink of a glass being set on a coaster. He was there, I was here, separated by space but connected by this bizarre, unspoken contract. I was an object, I was a piece of living art he had commissioned for the afternoon. A human statue. The maid in the chair. Minutes bled into one another. My back began to ache. My legs grew stiff. I had the overwhelming urge to shift, to cross my legs, to turn my head, but I didn't. His instruction was to sit and look out the window. Any movement felt like a violation, a rejection. What did it mean if I failed at this? The sun moved across the sky, its light shifting through the room. I watched its slow progress, marking time by the creeping shadows. An hour passed, then 2. My body was screaming. My mind was worse. It was a storm of panicked thoughts and silent pleas. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me? Please just let me go. He never spoke. The only sounds were the quiet indicators of his presence. He was living his day, reading his book while I was frozen in mine. The power in that, the sheer, effortless control was terrifying. He had not only purchased my time, he had purchased my stillness. Finally, after an eternity that my watch told me was 3.5 hours, I heard his footsteps approaching. They stopped directly behind me. I could feel his presence, a weight in the air. I braced myself. That is enough for today, he said. The relief was so sudden and total that I almost slumped. My muscles, locked in place for hours, trembled with the release of tension. I stood up, my joints stiff and protesting. I didn't dare turn to face him. The envelope is on the console table, he said. Tomorrow we will do the same. The same. This was the new routine. This was my job now. I turned, keeping my eyes down. I saw the familiar white envelope on the polished wood of the table by the door. I walked over, my legs unsteady, and picked it up. It felt thick, heavier than yesterday. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I just walked to the door, my hand closing around the cold metal of the handle. Rachel, he said. My name, he had never used my name before. It sent a jolt of pure ice through me. I stopped, my back to him, but I couldn't turn. I couldn't speak. The dress, he said, his voice still perfectly level. Wear the blue one tomorrow. The walk from his suite back to the staff changing rooms was the longest walk of my life. The black dress was folded neatly inside a hotel laundry bag, the plastic crinkling with every step I took. It felt heavier than it should, weighted down by his final words. Wear the dress tomorrow. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact, a schedule entry. Tomorrow, you will come here and you will wear this. The pretense was gone. I wasn't a maid anymore. I was something else. Something you put on a chair? What did it turn me into? I didn't go to Mrs. Evans. What was the point? She would just tilt her head, her smile tight and professional, and remind me how important Mr. Whitmore was. She would tell me to handle it. This was me handling it. This was me not saying no. That night, I barely slept. I kept seeing him in the dark, sitting in his chair, his eyes following me. I felt the phantom weight of the sapphire necklace on my skin, cold and heavy. I felt the smooth fabric of the dress he chose. His choices were becoming my reality, my uniform. The next morning, I stood in front of my locker, my hand hovering over the handle. My regular uniform, starched and clean, hung inside. It felt like a costume from a life I used to live, a life from yesterday. I couldn't bring myself to put on the black dress here, not in front of the other women. Maria or Sophia might see. They might ask questions I couldn't answer. Questions like, "Why aren't you wearing your uniform, Rachel?" Or "Whose dress is that?" So I did the only thing I could think of. I took the laundry bag with the dress into the largest of the public restrooms on the mezzanine floor. It was opulent and always empty at this hour, all marble and gold fixtures. I locked myself in a stall, the cool, silent space feeling like a confessional. My hands shook as I took off my uniform. The sensible polyester, the practical apron. I folded them carefully, a ritual for a job I was no longer performing. Then I pulled the black dress over my head. The fabric was cool and slid over my skin like water. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. I looked at my reflection in the polished marble wall. A distorted, wavy version of a woman in a black dress. I didn't look like me. I looked like someone pretending to be elegant, someone trapped. I left my uniform hidden in my locker and took the elevator up. No cart, no cleaning supplies, just me and the key card. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I felt exposed. Anyone who saw me would know I didn't belong. A maid playing dress up. But the hallways were empty. The hotel was its own quiet world, guarding its secrets. I let myself into his suite. He was there, of course, sitting in the armchair by the window, just like always. He looked up when I entered, his eyes taking in the dress. There was no smile, no flicker of surprise. Just a quiet, settled look of approval. The look of a man seeing something he owned fall perfectly into place. He didn't speak. He just gestured with one hand toward the other chair, the chair. My chair. I walked over and sat down. The silence fell around us, thick and familiar. I folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had yesterday. I stared at the spot on the wall just over his shoulder. The minutes stretched out. 1 hour bled into the next. My back started to ache. My legs felt stiff. I was a statue again, a living doll. I wondered if this was it, if this was the new routine. Show up, put on the dress, sit in the chair for 4 hours, and leave. It was bizarre. It was unnerving. But if this was all he wanted, maybe I could survive it. Maybe this was the dead end. I was wrong. It was around noon when a soft chime echoed from the door. My head jerked toward the sound, a reflex I couldn't control. Mr. Whitmore didn't move. He just continued to watch me. He pressed a small button on the side table next to him. The lock clicked open. A room service attendant, a young man named Leo, pushed a large trolley into the room. He was new. I'd seen him in the cafeteria. He smiled nervously. "Mr. Whitmore, your lunch." The trolley was laden with silver cloches, a bottle of sparkling water, a small bucket of ice. The smell hit me immediately. Roasted chicken, garlic, fresh bread. My stomach clenched with a sudden sharp hunger. I hadn't eaten since a piece of toast at 6 that morning. Leo, with practiced efficiency, began setting a small table next to Mr. Whitmore's chair. He placed a crisp white napkin, polished silverware, a heavy crystal glass. He did it all without looking at me. It was as if the chair I was sitting in was empty. I was just part of the furniture, a lamp, a painting, invisible. Did he not see me? A woman in a black cocktail dress, sitting bolt upright in the middle of a hotel suite at noon. He must have. But his face was a mask of professional indifference. He was here to serve the guest, the important guest. I was not part of the equation. Leo lifted the silver domes. One plate held a perfectly roasted half-chicken, skin glistening. Another held roasted potatoes and asparagus. A small bowl contained a green salad. My mouth went dry. My stomach growled, a low, humiliating rumble in the silent room. I pressed a hand against it, hoping Mr. Whitmore hadn't heard. He had. I saw the barest hint of a smile touch the corner of his mouth before it vanished. "That will be all," Mr. Whitmore said. His voice was smooth, calm. "Enjoy your meal, sir," Leo said, and then he was gone, backing out of the room and pulling the door silently shut behind him. We were alone again, just me, him, and the smell of his food. He picked up his fork and knife. The sound of the silver knife cutting through the crisp chicken skin was loud in the quiet room. The scrape of the fork on the china, the soft, wet sound of him chewing. Every noise was magnified. Every scent was a form of torture. He ate slowly, deliberately, and he never ever stopped watching me. His eyes were on me as he lifted a piece of potato to his lips. They were on me as he chewed, his jaw working methodically. They were on me as he took a sip of water, the crystal glass cool against his mouth. I couldn't look away. I was pinned by his gaze. He was performing for me, and I was his captive audience. This was the show, a man eating his lunch, and it was the most violating thing I'd ever experienced. He was demonstrating his power in the most basic way possible. He was satisfying his hunger while I was forced to feel mine. He was nourishing himself while I sat there, empty. He was living, breathing, consuming. I was just sitting. An object that didn't need food. An object that didn't have needs. My stomach cramped again, harder this time. I felt a wave of dizziness. I focused on the spot on the wall, trying to transport myself out of the room, out of my own body. But the smell of garlic and rosemary kept pulling me back. The sound of his chewing. It felt like it lasted for an eternity. Each bite he took was an insult. Each swallow a reminder of my powerlessness. I was a maid. I was a doll. Now I was a beggar, forced to watch a king feast. Finally, he set his fork and knife down. He had eaten everything. The plate was clean except for a few bones. He dabbed his mouth with the napkin, folded it, and placed it on the table. He looked at me, his face unreadable. The silence returned, now filled with the ghost of his meal. He sat there for another 10 minutes, just watching me starve, watching me obey. Then he spoke. His voice was as quiet as ever. "That is all for today, Rachel." It was a dismissal. I stood up, my legs stiff and unsteady. I felt lightheaded. My body was screaming for food, for water, for escape. I walked toward the door, my movements wooden. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As my hand touched the doorknob, his voice stopped me. "Tomorrow," he said, "same time." I just nodded at the closed door in front of me. I couldn't speak. The only thing in my throat was the acid of an empty stomach. I stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut. The click of the lock sealing him inside his world, and me outside in mine, was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I leaned against the wall, my whole body trembling, not from fear, but from a hunger so deep it felt like it was hollowing me out from the inside. The clink of his fork against the porcelain plate was the only sound. It was the last sound. He placed the silverware neatly on either side of the plate, the knife and fork parallel. A silent declaration that he was finished. Then he lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were flat, not angry, not satisfied, just observing, like a scientist watching a specimen under glass. He had eaten an entire meal, a rich, fragrant meal, and I had been forced to watch every single bite. The scent of roasted meat and garlic still hung in the air, a ghost on my tongue. I was an ornament, a piece of the room's decor that happened to breathe. He dabbed the corners of his mouth with a white linen napkin, a slow and deliberate gesture. He folded it and set it on the table. The silence stretched. It was different now. It wasn't the empty silence of waiting anymore. It was the heavy silence of expectation, What now? What came after the meal? My mind was a blank wall of fear. I was just a woman in a chair, wearing a dress that wasn't mine, in a room that felt like it was shrinking. I kept my eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over his shoulder. It was a small, swirling pattern in the expensive wallpaper. I focused on it. I tried to make it the only thing in the world. Then my body betrayed me. A low, guttural growl echoed in the quiet room. It was my stomach, a raw animal noise of pure aching hunger. It was loud, it was shameful. It was a sound of need, of life, of a part of me that refused to be a silent statue in a chair. I froze. My blood turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. Don't make him feel rejected. Was this rejection? Was a simple human sound a form of defiance? My mind raced, trying to find a way to take it back, to swallow the noise. But it was already out there, hanging in the air between us, an ugly, desperate truth. I didn't dare look at his face. I kept my eyes locked on the wallpaper, praying he hadn't heard, or that he would ignore it, that he would dismiss it as the plumbing or a sound from outside. But he didn't. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move. He leaned forward slightly. I could feel his gaze intensify, pinning me to the chair. The silence that followed the noise was 100 times worse than the silence before it. It was thick with judgment. Then I saw his hand. He placed his fingertips on the edge of his dinner plate, and with one smooth, unhurried motion, he pushed it across the polished wood of the table. It stopped about a foot in front of me. On the plate was a single, lonely piece of steak surrounded by a congealed ring of sauce. A few limp spears of asparagus lay beside it. His leftovers. He didn't say a word. He just pushed the plate toward me and waited. This was a new kind of test, a new, unimagined level of humiliation. He had starved me with the smell of his food, and now he was offering me his scraps, like a dog. My whole body screamed no. It was a deep, primal refusal that started in my gut and rose up into my throat. No, I am not an animal. I am a person, a woman. My name is Rachel. But Mrs. Evans' voice was right there, whispering in my ear. He's a very important client, Rachel. We can't have any issues. Just handle it. And the most important rule of all, the one that governed my entire existence in this suite. Don't make him feel rejected. What would refusing the food be, if not the ultimate rejection? It was a direct no. It was a refusal of his gift, his command. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that saying no was not an option. I had been told that. The consequences were a black hole I was terrified to look into. My hunger was a physical pain now, a sharp, cramping ache in my stomach. The smell of the cold meat was nauseating and tempting all at once. What was worse? The humiliation of eating his leftovers, or the unknown punishment for refusing them? I was trapped. He had built the cage so perfectly. My own body, my own hunger, was a bar in the cage. Mrs. Evans had supplied the lock. Mr. Whitmore held the key. Slowly, like an old woman, I leaned forward. My movements felt stiff, disconnected from my mind. I was watching myself do this. I reached out a trembling hand and picked up the heavy, cold fork. My fingers were clumsy. The fork felt alien in my hand. I looked at the piece of meat. It was graying at the edges. I speared it. I raised it to my mouth. My eyes met his. For the first time since the sound, I looked directly at him. There was nothing in his expression. No triumph, no disgust, no satisfaction. Just the same flat, empty observation. He was watching his experiment unfold exactly as he'd predicted. The meat was cold and tough. The fat was waxy on my tongue. I had to chew for a long time. Each movement of my jaw was a surrender. Each swallow was a defeat. I did not taste the food. I only tasted the shame. It was metallic and bitter like blood. I ate the single piece of steak. Then I picked up one of the cold spears of asparagus. I ate that too. I did not look at him again. I looked at the plate. I focused on the task. Clear the plate. Obey the silent command. Survive the shift. When I had eaten the last piece, I placed the fork back down on the porcelain. The clink was just as loud as his had been, but it felt different. It felt like a final punctuation mark on my own dignity. I leaned back in the chair. I felt sick. I felt hollow. The food sat in my stomach like a stone. offering no nourishment, only a heavy reminder of what I had done, of what I had become. He watched me for another minute, or maybe it was an hour. Time had ceased to have any meaning. Then his voice, quiet and even. "That will be all for today, Rachel." It was the first time he had used my name. Hearing it from his lips felt like a brand. He knew me. He had named his pet. I didn't respond. I just stood up. My legs were unsteady. The beautiful blue dress felt like a costume for a play I never wanted to be in. I turned and walked toward the door, my back straight, my head held high. It was the only thing I had left. I didn't look back. I walked out of the suite, pulled the door shut behind me, and leaned against the wall in the silent, empty hallway. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the plush carpet. I pulled my knees to my chest. I thought about the cold meat in my stomach. I thought about the look in his eyes. He wasn't just controlling my body anymore. He was inside my head. He was changing the very shape of me, hollowing me out and filling the space with fear and obedience. What did it turn me into? I sat there for a long time in the hallway of the 16th floor before I finally found the strength to get up, go to the locker room, and put my own clothes back on. They felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else, someone I used to know. The food sat in my stomach like a stone. It was rich food, better than anything I had eaten in months, but it didn't feel like nourishment. It felt like poison. Each bite I had taken was a small death, a surrender. I set the fork down on the plate. The china made a soft, final click. He was still watching me. His expression was unreadable, but there was a stillness to him, a satisfaction. Like an artist who had just placed the final, perfect brushstroke on a canvas. He had made me into what he wanted. He had made me eat from his plate. What did that turn me into? He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the gesture of dismissal. The session was over. I stood up. My legs felt shaky. The silk of the dress whispered against my skin, a constant reminder that I wasn't wearing my own clothes. I didn't look at him as I walked to the small changing room. My movements felt robotic, rehearsed. Take off the dress, fold it carefully, take off the necklace, place it back in its velvet box. Put on my uniform. My uniform had never felt so good. It was armor. It was me. Stiff, gray, anonymous. It was a lie, of course. He knew exactly who I was, but it was the only thing I had left to cling to. When I stepped out of the small room, the plate was gone. The table was clear. It was as if it never happened. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the hunger had made me see things. But the feeling in my stomach was real. The shame was real. He was standing by the window now, looking out at the city lights. He didn't turn as I left. I closed the heavy door to the suite behind me, the sound echoing in the silent carpeted hallway. I didn't go straight back to the staff room. I couldn't. I walked to the end of the hall to a service elevator and rode it down to the basement. I found a small, hidden utility closet and locked myself inside. It smelled of bleach and damp rags. I leaned my head against the cool metal shelving and cried. Not loud, heaving sobs, just silent, hot tears that tracked down my face and dripped onto the concrete floor. I was crying for my hunger, for my dignity. I was crying because I didn't know how to say no. Don't make him feel rejected. The words were a brand on my mind. What would happen if I did? Would he tell Mrs. Evans? Would I be fired for being unprofessional? For refusing to... what? Eat a meal? It sounded insane when I thought about it, but in that room with him, it was the most logical thing in the world. The next morning, the dread was a physical presence. It sat on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Getting dressed, making my coffee, walking to the bus stop, every normal action felt like a step toward a cliff. I thought about calling in sick, but for how long? One day? A week? He was a long-term guest. He wasn't going anywhere. And I couldn't afford to lose a day's pay, let alone my job. The bills were piled on my small kitchen table, a silent, menacing army. They were his allies. When I arrived at the hotel, Mrs. Evans was in the hallway. She gave me a bright plastic smile. "Good morning, Rachel. Everything going smoothly with Mr. Whitmore?" I just nodded. What could I say? He made me eat his leftovers like a dog. She would just stare at me. She would say I was being dramatic. She would say he was a valuable client. She would find a way to make it my fault. Silence was safe. I pushed my cart toward the penthouse floor. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. The quiet hum of the machinery sounded like a countdown. When I reached his door, I paused. My hand trembled as I lifted the keycard. For a second, I imagined just turning around, walking away, getting on a bus and never coming back. But where would I go? I took a breath and opened the door. The suite was the same as always, clean, quiet, filled with the faint, expensive scent of his cologne. He was sitting in the same chair he always sat in, the one facing the center of the room. He was wearing a dark gray suit, perfectly tailored. He looked like he was waiting for a business meeting, not for a maid to arrive. I was wearing my uniform. I hadn't been instructed to change. I started my routine, dusting the surfaces on the far side of the room, keeping my back to him as much as possible. I was waiting for the instruction to change, to walk, to sit. But nothing came. The silence grew louder and louder. It pressed in on me. I finished dusting. I moved to straighten the magazines on a coffee table. My hands were shaking so badly that the glossy pages rattled. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, measured. It cut through the silence like a knife. "You're nervous today." I froze. My hand hovered over a magazine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I didn't answer. I wasn't supposed to answer. I forced myself to move again, to continue my task. I pretended I hadn't heard him. He spoke again, his voice holding the same quiet authority. "You were ashamed yesterday. After you ate, you felt like an animal." My blood ran cold. I stopped moving completely. I stood with my back to him, staring at a picture on the wall, a swirl of abstract colors that suddenly felt like a portrait of my own mind. How could he know? Those were my thoughts, my words, the ones I had cried over in the utility closet. It felt like he had reached into my head and plucked them out. "But you were also relieved," he continued, his voice relentless, "because you were so hungry. And it was good food. You hated yourself for enjoying it." I squeezed my eyes shut. Cho. No. Stop. This was new. This was worse than the dress, worse than the food. He was trying to own my thoughts now. He was narrating my life, my feelings. I turned around slowly. I had to see his face. He was looking right at me. There was no emotion in his eyes. He was like a scientist observing a specimen. "What do you want?" The words escaped my mouth before I could stop them. They were barely a whisper. A flicker of something surprised interest crossed his face. It was the first time I had ever questioned him directly. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he tilted his head. "You think no one sees you. You've spent your whole life trying to be invisible. You think if you're quiet enough, if you work hard enough, nothing bad can happen to you." It was like he was reading a biography I had never written. Every word was true, and hearing him say it felt like a violation. He was taking my life, my private, lonely life, and holding it up for inspection. "That's not true," I said, my voice trembling. "Isn't it?" he said, his tone gentle, which made it even more terrifying. "You were a quiet child, always watching the other children play but never joining in, afraid of getting your clothes dirty, afraid of being noticed." He was guessing. He had to be guessing. He couldn't possibly know that. But it was so specific. I remembered standing by the chain-link fence of my elementary school playground, watching the other girls on the swings, my hands clenched behind my back. What did he see when he looked at me? How could he see so much? "Today," he said, changing the subject as if we had just been discussing the weather, "you will not clean. You will sit in the chair, the one opposite me." It was a relief, a simple command, something physical. I walked to the chair he indicated and sat down. It was a firm, upholstered armchair, identical to his. We were facing each other now, about 10 feet apart. A chess match without a board. I stared at my hands, folded in my lap. I would not look at him. I would not let him in. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was charged. I could feel his eyes on me. I could feel him thinking. And the worst part was, I felt like I could hear what he was thinking. "I see you. I know you." After what felt like an hour, he spoke again. "You're wondering why I chose you." My head snapped up. I looked at him, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was the question that haunted me. Why me? He offered no answer. He just held my gaze. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This was his goal. It wasn't about the dress or the food. It was about this. It was about breaking down the walls of my mind until there was no difference between his thoughts and my own. He didn't just want to control what I did. He wanted to be the voice inside my head. He wanted to own me from the inside out. The words hung in the air of that quiet, sterile room. From the inside out. They were not a threat shouted in anger. They were a statement of fact delivered with the same calm neutrality he used to order his breakfast. My blood went cold. It was a cold that started in my stomach and spread through my limbs until I was sure I was made of ice. And my mind, which had been racing for weeks, went completely, terrifyingly blank. There was nothing, just the echo of his words. He watched me, his head tilted slightly. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted to see the moment his statement landed, the moment I understood. "You're wondering how," he said, his voice still soft. It wasn't a question. "You think I hired someone, a private investigator. You think they dug through public records, talked to old neighbors?" I didn't move. I couldn't. "That's the logical explanation," he continued, a faint smile touching his lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a scientist looking at a specimen under a microscope. "But that's surface level. That's the outside. I told you, I'm not interested in the outside." My breath hitched. What did that mean? What did any of this mean? "When you were 9, he said, leaning forward just an inch, "you had a fever, a bad one. Your mother put a cool cloth on your forehead and told you stories about a little gray rabbit who lived in the moon. You fell asleep and dreamed the rabbit came down and told you a secret. But when you woke up, you couldn't remember what it was. You cried for an hour because you had lost the rabbit's secret." The world tilted. It wasn't a big memory. It wasn't a trauma. It was nothing. A forgotten Tuesday afternoon from more than 30 years ago. I hadn't thought of that little gray rabbit since I was a child. I had forgotten the feeling of that specific frustration, the desperate childhood certainty that I had lost something magical and irreplaceable. But hearing him say it, the memory bloomed in my mind in perfect, vibrant color. The scratchy wool of the blanket, the smell of Vicks on my mother's hands, the exact pattern of the water stain on my bedroom ceiling that I had imagined was the rabbit's home. How? The word was a silent scream in my head. How? A private investigator couldn't know that. No record held that information. I had never told anyone that story. Not my ex-husband, not a single friend. It was a piece of my life so small and so deeply buried I hadn't even known it was still there. But he knew. He knew it like he had been in the room with me. "What do you want?" The words came out as a dry whisper. My throat was sandpaper. He settled back in his chair. "I want you to understand the nature of our arrangement, Rachel. You are not here to clean my room. You are not here to wear my dresses or sit in a chair. Those were preliminaries. Exercises." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the space between us. "You are here to give me what I want. And what I want is you, not your body, not your time. You. The parts you don't show anyone. The parts you've forgotten yourself." My hands, resting in my lap, were trembling so hard the fabric of the dress shook. I pressed them down, trying to still them. "Don't make him feel rejected." Mrs. Evans' voice was a ghost in the room, a poison in my ear. How did I follow that rule now? What did it mean to not reject a man who claimed to know my childhood dreams? If I screamed, was that rejection? If I ran, was that rejection? If I sat here, frozen in terror, was he feeling rejected? What did it turn me into if I didn't say no to this? "Tell me about the rabbit," he commanded. The softness was gone. It was an order. "Tell me what it felt like, losing its secret." I stared at him. This was the new task. It wasn't walking or sitting or eating his scraps. It was this. He wanted me to take that memory, that tiny private piece of my own history, and hand it over to him. He didn't just want to know it. He wanted to hear it from my own mouth. He wanted me to participate. Silence. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, each sound a hammer blow against my skull. 1 second, 2, 10, a minute. I couldn't speak. The words were locked in my throat, behind a wall of pure animal fear. Saying no was impossible. The thought of it sent a jolt of panic through me, my job, my apartment, the fragile scaffolding of my life collapsing. But saying yes felt like a different kind of death. It felt like letting him win, like agreeing that he had the right to be there, inside my head, rummaging through my past. His eyes narrowed. A flicker of something cold passed through them. Impatience. "Rachel," he said, and the single word was a threat. I closed my eyes. I saw my small bedroom. I smelled the sickness and my mother's perfume. I felt the phantom weight of the cool cloth on my skin. "I was hot," I began, my voice a croak. I didn't recognize it as my own. The sheets were tangled. He just watched me. His focus was absolute. He wasn't just listening, he was absorbing. "My mom, she told me a story to help me sleep." My voice was stronger now, but flatter, emptier. I was just reciting facts. I was trying to keep the feeling out of it, to give him the words, but not the soul of the memory. "She said there was a rabbit who lived on the moon," I said, "a little gray one." "And the secret," he prompted, his voice low and insistent. "Tell me about losing the secret." I had to swallow. I dreamed it. The rabbit came to my window, and it whispered something. I knew it was important. I looked down at my hands. They were clenched into white-knuckled fists. When I woke up, the sun was bright, and I couldn't remember. I tried. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to go back to sleep, to find the dream again. But it was just gone. A tear slid down my cheek. I hadn't cried in this room before. I hadn't let myself. But this was different. This wasn't humiliation. This was grief. I was mourning a secret lost 33 years ago, and I was mourning the self who had owned that memory privately until this very moment. "I cried," I whispered. "I cried because I knew I would never get it back." When I finished, the silence returned. It was heavier this time, thick with what I had given him. I had taken a piece of myself, a piece of my childhood, and laid it at his feet. And for what? To keep a job, to pay my rent. He nodded slowly, a deep, satisfied nod. He looked like a man who had just finished a fine meal. "Good," he said. Just that one word, good. It wasn't praise, it was an assessment, a confirmation. I had performed the task correctly. I had obeyed. I had not rejected him. He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. "That will be all for today, Rachel." The shift was over. I stood up on unsteady legs. The movement felt clumsy, robotic. I walked to the bathroom, my own reflection in the marble, a stranger's face, pale, haunted, with wide, empty eyes. I stripped off the silk dress, folding it with the numb precision of a machine. I put on my uniform. The familiar polyester felt foreign, a costume that no longer fit. It was the uniform of a maid, a worker. But I wasn't that anymore. I didn't know what I was. I walked out of the bathroom. He was still in his chair, watching the spot where I had been sitting, as if my ghost were still there. He didn't look at me as I let myself out of the suite. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, and I leaned against the wall in the silent, carpeted hallway. The fear was different now. Before the suite was the cage. The fear lived in that room, and I could walk away from it for a few hours. I could go home, lock my own door, and pretend it wasn't real. But not anymore. He had done exactly what he said he would do. He had reached inside me and taken something. It wasn't his, but it wasn't just mine anymore either. It was a thing between us now, a shared secret. His first claim of ownership staked deep inside me. The cage wasn't the room anymore. The cage was my own mind. And I had no idea how I was ever going to get out. The last word of my own memory left my lips and hung in the air between us. It was the memory of a dream, a secret thing I hadn't thought of in 30 years, and I had just given it to him. The silence that followed was different from the others. It wasn't empty, it was full. It was the sound of a lock clicking shut. He sat perfectly still in his armchair, the tips of his fingers steepled. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked satisfied, like a man who had finally acquired a rare and precious object he'd been pursuing for a long time. Me. He had acquired me. The thought was so cold, so sharp, it felt like a shard of glass in my gut. He hadn't just made me wear his dresses or eat his scraps. He had reached into the locked attic of my mind, pulled out a dusty, forgotten box, and forced me to show him what was inside. He owned my past now. "Very good, Rachel," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. It was the voice you might use to soothe a frightened animal after you'd successfully gotten it into a cage. You have a good memory when you're told what to remember. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? My throat was dry. My hands felt numb at my sides. I was still wearing the navy blue dress. It felt like a costume for a play I never agreed to be in. He unlaced his fingers and leaned forward slightly. That dream, he began, about the birds. It wasn't just about being trapped. It was about your father. I flinched. It was an involuntary jerk of my shoulders. He built you that birdhouse, didn't he? The summer you were 10, Mr. Whitmore continued, his eyes fixed on my face, watching for every flicker of emotion. He was so proud of it. He told you it was for the Wrens, so they would have a safe home. But you knew even then that a home with a door someone else controls is just a box. How? The question screamed in my head, a silent, frantic noise. How do you know that? It wasn't a famous story. It wasn't something I told people. It was a feeling, a child's quiet observation, a piece of my own personal history that even I had forgotten until this very moment. He was not just pulling out memories, he was interpreting them. He was telling me what my own life meant. He wanted to keep you safe, Mr. Whitmore said, his voice a low murmur, to protect you. But what you felt was the cage. The love was the lock. You've been looking for a way out of that birdhouse your whole life, haven't you, Rachel? I just stared at him, my mind a total blank. He was twisting something good, something I remembered as a kindness from my father, and turning it into something else, something that suited his own story. He was rewriting me, page by page. He stood up. The movement was low, deliberate. He walked to the window and looked out over the city lights, his back to me. For a moment, I thought it was over for the day. For a moment, I thought I could breathe. Your shift is ending soon, he said, his voice distant. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. You will go home. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic far below, the sound of a world that was still real, a world where people went home and were free. It felt a million miles away. I want you to do something for me tonight, he said, turning from the window. His face was in shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and absolute. My stomach tightened. What is it? When you get home, I want you to make dinner. The request was so normal, so mundane that it was jarring. Dinner. I made dinner every night. What did that mean? What did he want? I want you to have chicken, he said. A roasted chicken breast with boiled potatoes and green beans, nothing else. I blinked. Chicken? Yes, no butter on the potatoes, just salt. And no sauce for the chicken. Do you understand? I swallowed. It was a test. It had to be a test. It was simple, meaningless, but it wasn't. It was about obedience. It was about his control following me out of this suite, through the hotel corridors and all the way home, into my kitchen, onto my plate. Why? The word escaped before I could stop it. It was a stupid, dangerous question. He took a step closer. The light from the lamp caught his face. There was no anger there, only a chilling sort of patience. Because I want to know that you are thinking of me. Because from now on, even when you are not here, you are still with me. I am in your head now, Rachel. Don't you feel it? I did. I felt him like a fever, a constant low-grade hum beneath my own thoughts. Don't make him feel rejected, Mrs. Evans' voice echoed in my memory. The instruction was so simple and so absolute. It covered everything, my work, my clothes, my food, my memories. I understand, I whispered. Good, he said. He walked over to the small writing desk and pulled a single bill from his wallet. $100 bill. He held it out to me. For the groceries. I didn't move. Taking money from him for this felt different. It felt like payment. It made me something I didn't want to be. Take it, he said, his voice firm. It was not a request. My hand trembled as I reached out and took the bill. His fingers brushed against mine. They were cold. The paper felt heavy, like a stone. You may go now, he said, dismissing me as if I were nothing more than a servant who had received her orders for the day. I turned and walked toward the door, my back straight, my legs stiff. I didn't let myself run. I opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it softly behind me. The click of the latch was the only sound. I leaned against the wall in the empty corridor, the thick patterned wallpaper pressing into my back. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I was out. I was free. But I wasn't. The feeling of his presence didn't fade as I walked to the staff elevator. It didn't fade as I changed back into my own worn clothes in the locker room, the cheap fabric, a comfort and a lie. I could still feel the phantom weight of the navy dress. I could still hear his voice telling me about my own father. The bus ride home was a blur. I stared out the window at the passing streets, but I didn't see them. I saw a small wooden birdhouse. I saw a plate of chicken, potatoes, and green beans. When I got to my small apartment, I locked the door behind me. This was my space, my safe place. But it didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like an extension of his suite. A room he had allowed me to retreat to, for now. I went into my little kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There was half a lasagna in there from 2 nights ago. My favorite, easy. I could just heat it up. I stood there, staring at the lasagna. My stomach growled. It was my food, my choice. But what if he knew? The question was insane. He was a man in a hotel suite miles away. He couldn't know what I was eating in the privacy of my own home. But he knew about a dream I had when I was 12. He knew what my father said to me in the summer of 1994. The source of his knowledge was a terrifying black hole. It didn't follow the rules of logic. How could I be sure it was limited by distance? The $100 bill was in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was crisp and real. An order and the means to fulfill it. Rejecting him wasn't about saying no to his face. It was about disobeying, even in secret, and I was too scared to find out what would happen if he felt rejected. Slowly, I closed the refrigerator door, leaving the lasagna inside. I put my coat back on and picked up my purse. The small grocery store on the corner was still open. They sold chicken breasts and potatoes. They sold green beans. As I walked out into the cool night air, a single horrifying thought settled in my mind. He was owning me from the inside out, just like he said. First my time, then my body, then my memories, now my choices. I wondered what he would want me to eat tomorrow, and what would he want me to dream about tonight. The walk home was a blur. The city lights smeared past me, headlights turning into long wet streaks. His voice was a recording stuck on a loop in my head. Lamb chops, medium rare, roasted potatoes, asparagus with lemon. It wasn't a request. It was a command, a grocery list. My apartment door clicked shut behind me, and the sound was hollow, meaningless. This place had always been my sanctuary. Small, a little worn, but mine. It was the one place on earth that had nothing to do with the hotel with Mrs. Evans, with him. Now that was gone. He had reached into my home with nothing but a few words spoken over a telephone. For a moment, I stood in my tiny entryway, my purse strap digging into my shoulder. I could just not do it. I could make my usual toast with peanut butter. I could boil a packet of instant noodles. Who would know? But I knew that was a lie. He would know. The same way he knew about my father's hands, the same way he knew about a dream I'd had when I was 9 years old. To defy the instruction felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. I didn't know how deep the fall was. I didn't know what was at the bottom. The one rule they gave me, the only rule that mattered, was still there, tattooed on the inside of my skull. Don't make him feel rejected. So I went to the store. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour market felt harsh, accusatory. I felt like a thief or an actress in a play I hadn't rehearsed. I walked through the aisles like a robot, my hands picking up items that felt alien. Lamb chops, thick and decadent behind the butcher's glass. A bright green bunch of asparagus. A net bag of yellow lemons. Everything was expensive. It was more than I usually spent on groceries for 3 days. I paid with my debit card, the transaction feeling like a confession. Back in my kitchen, the silence was heavy. I unwrapped the meat, I washed the vegetables. My movements were stiff, mechanical. This wasn't cooking, it was assembly. It was the careful, joyless process of following an order. The smell of the lamb searing in the pan was rich and foreign. It was the smell of his world, not mine. It was the smell of money. I thought about my father. He used to love the smell of a simple stew cooking on the stove, the scent of onions and carrots filling our small house. It was a smell of warmth, of safety. This was different. This smelled like power. I plated the food on one of my plain white dishes, the lamb, glistening in pink in the center, the bright green spears of asparagus, drizzled with oil and a squeeze of lemon, the golden crispy potatoes. It looked like a picture from a magazine, a meal for someone else, for an important person. I sat at my small kitchen table and looked at it. I wasn't hungry. My stomach was a tight knot of fear, but the command was to cook it and eat it. Eating it was part of the task. It was the final act of compliance. I picked up my fork. The first bite was tasteless. The texture was right. The meat was tender. But my tongue couldn't register flavor. It was just matter. I chewed. I swallowed. It felt like eating dust. It was the food of a stranger, a meal I had no right to, cooked in my own kitchen as if I were a ghost haunting my own life. I ate every last bite because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't. I washed the plate, scrubbed the pan until my knuckles were raw, and threw the bones away in a separate sealed bag, as if hiding evidence of a crime. Sleep didn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondered what he would demand next. Would he tell me what to watch on television, what to read before bed, what to dream about? The thought sent a tremor through me. Maybe he already knew. The next morning, the hotel looked the same. The sun glinted off the glass doors. The valets smiled their polished smiles. But for me, it felt like walking into the mouth of something vast and patient. I got my cart, my key card. I avoided looking at anyone. I felt marked. The elevator ride up was the longest it had ever been. The soft ding of the penthouse floor sounded like a verdict. I swiped the card, the green light blinked, and I pushed the door open. He was there. Of course he was there. Sitting in the armchair by the window, the one that looked out over the entire city. He wasn't reading. He wasn't on the phone. He was just sitting, waiting. I closed the door behind me, and the latch clicked with deafening finality. The air was still. I didn't say hello. I didn't know if I was supposed to. I just stood by the door, my hands clasped in front of me, a maid waiting for instructions that no longer had anything to do with cleaning. He turned his head slowly. His eyes weren't cold, not exactly. They were just observant, like a scientist studying a specimen. He didn't say anything for a long time. The silence stretched until it was a physical thing, a pressure against my ears. "Good morning, Rachel," he said finally. His voice was calm even. "Good morning, sir." The words were a croak. He gestured to the chair opposite him, the one I had sat in before. I walked over and sat down, my back straight, my hands in my lap. I felt the expensive fabric of the dress. He'd bought me against my skin. My uniform was a distant memory. He watched me. I kept my eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over his shoulder. "Tell me about your dinner," he said. My blood went cold. It wasn't a question. It was the same tone he'd used on the phone. An order. He wanted a report. He wanted me to perform my obedience for him. I swallowed. I had lamb chops. "Oh," he said, a flicker of something in his eyes. "Tell me about them." My voice was a monotone, a flat recitation of facts. They were medium rare. I seared them in a pan with oil. And I roasted potatoes and asparagus with lemon. Each word felt like I was handing him a piece of myself, a piece of my home. "Did you use any herbs on the potatoes?" he asked, his head tilted slightly. I froze. I hadn't mentioned that. He hadn't mentioned that. But when I was chopping them on autopilot, my hands had reached for the little jar of dried rosemary on my spice rack. A habit, a tiny, unconscious act of making the food my own. How could he possibly know? The question must have shown on my face, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. He knew. He just knew. The room began to feel small, the air thin. Was he watching me? Were there cameras in my apartment? The idea was so insane, yet here in this suite it felt terrifyingly plausible. Or was it something else? Something worse? "Rosemary," he said, answering his own question. He gave a small, slow nod. It wasn't a smile of approval, it was a nod of confirmation, a quiet acknowledgement of his own omniscience. "A good choice. It brings out the flavor." I just stared at him, my mind a complete blank. The fear was so total it had burned away every other thought. He let the silence hang for another minute, letting the implication of his knowledge sink into me. letting it poison every memory of my time in my own home. My sanctuary was an illusion. There was no outside. There was only him. Then he changed the subject, the shift so abrupt it gave me vertigo. "I see you speaking with the other staff sometimes," he said, his tone conversational. "In the hallways, in the break room." I didn't know what to say. I nodded. "Maria, from housekeeping, the one with the dark hair. You seem friendly with her." "Maria, yes." We sometimes shared a quick lunch, complaining about our sore feet, talking about our kids. She was kind. She had a loud, happy laugh. Hearing her name in his mouth felt like a violation. "She's a co-worker," I managed to say. "She is a distraction," Mr. Whitmore said simply. The words were not harsh, but they were absolute. "Your focus here is important. Your professionalism is paramount." He was using their words, Mrs. Evans's words, professionalism, important. He was twisting the language of the hotel into a weapon just for me. "I don't want you speaking to her anymore," he said. He looked directly into my eyes. "Not in the break room, not in the halls. If she speaks to you, you will be polite, brief, and you will walk away. You will not engage in conversation. Do you understand?" I thought of Maria's smile. I thought of the small 10-minute pockets of relief in my day, the brief moments of feeling like a normal person among other normal people. He was taking that. He was cutting the last thread that connected me to the world outside this suite. He was making my world smaller and smaller until it was only the size of this room, until it contained only him. What would Maria think? She would think I was rude. She would be hurt. I would lose the only person at this job who looked at me and saw a friend. But the alternative was to make him feel rejected. My throat was too tight to speak. All I could do was look at this man who knew what herbs I used in my own kitchen, and I nodded. Just a small, simple nod. He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He had my evenings, he had my past, and now he had my friendships. There was nothing left. I was completely and utterly his.